The Lexus RX has never been overly exciting. Instead, it's been something far more important. It's been a bestseller, and it now accounts for a full third of Lexus volume in North America. It is by far the best-selling gasoline-powered luxury vehicle in North America, and in 2023, it nearly outsold Volvo. And no, I don't mean outselling the XC90. I mean, it nearly outsold the entire Volvo lineup in North America. And I think it's easy to see why. The RX has always been incredibly easy to live with. In this video, we're going to talk about the entire RX lineup, which one might be right for you, and why I think the best Lexus RX is the one we're looking at today. It's the plug-in hybrid, because this is the easiest model to live with. One of the most interesting things about the RX is that even though there are 4 different drivetrains to choose from and a ton of different options available, it has a relatively narrow pricing window. It starts at around $50,500 and goes on up to about $74,000. And for that top-end price, you can choose whether you want the plug-in hybrid or the turbocharged hybrid without the plug. That's going to give you a bit more power, but it's going to sacrifice a lot of the refinement that we find in this hybrid system or the base hybrid system without a plug. Yep, you heard that right. There are 3 different hybrids to choose from. So ton of different options, ton of different drivetrains, lots of different hybrid variation. We'll talk about that in just a bit. The other thing we should talk about is the styling first, though, because this is, shall we say, significantly less controversial than the Lexus RX has been in the past. Yes, it still has the sort of spindle grille thing going on here, but it's definitely blended better with the rest of the front-end design. Unfortunately, they sent me a really dark blue one, so you really can't see all of the details here, but the bulk of this grille is made up by these little individual elements, and then we have some black accents here, and then that sort of blends into the body color section of the bumper. There are 2 basic looks. You'll get this in most of the models. If you get the F-Sport version, then we get a slightly different grille with the more F-Sport squiggly kind of thing going on there. The tri-beam LED headlights, those are optional, although you'll find them on a decent number of RXs on the lot, but they'll all have LED fog lights. Just above the fog light, we see what kind of looks like an aero duct, but it's actually just a styling element. It doesn't actually open to anything. The next thing we should do is talk about what's going on under the hood. As a lot of people have mentioned, every engine and transmission is shared with the mainstream Toyota product, from a RAV4 to a Highlander to a Grand Highlander. But what a lot of reviewers leave out is that that's not just a benefit to Lexus, that's benefit to you as a Lexus owner and Lexus customer, because it means the drivetrains are going to be more reliable. They can work out the kinks because they're building so many. But also long-term maintenance costs. They're going to be significantly lower than any of the European competitors. If you plan on keeping your luxury vehicle for 10 or 15 years, not only is this going to break less often than an X5 or a GLE, every kind of maintenance item, from oil changes, oil filters, air filters, etc., they're all going to be less expensive because this engine is exactly the same as the one found in that higher volume mainstream product. So not only do I find it not a problem, I actually think it's a significant advantage to the kind of luxury that Lexus is offering in the RX. It's not just about reliability, it's not just about the luxury features on the inside, it's about being lighter on your pocketbook, which is also why we have so many hybrids to choose from. If you don't want a hybrid though, there's still the RX 350. That gives you a 2.4-liter turbo from the Highlander, produces 275 horsepower, and will get you 24 to 25 miles per gallon combined. Most folks, I think, however, are going to want to opt for the base hybrid system. It uses this exact same hybrid system with a smaller battery and no plug in the back. That uses a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine borrowed from the Highlander and gives you 246 horsepower and a whopping 36 miles per gallon. It's easily the most efficient entry in this segment on gasoline, and honestly, one of the most efficient SUVs available in North America, period. If you want a bit more oomph and you want better fuel economy, you could choose the RX 500H. That has a 2.4-liter turbo and a 6-speed automatic, not the 8-speed we find in the base model, and 2 motor generator units. One's up front and one's on the rear axle. But it's not the same rear E all-wheel drive setup we find in the RX 350 or the RX 450. In the RX 500, the rear motor is available to operate at a wider range of speeds. So if you're, say, at 60 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour, in this vehicle, the rear motor is not doing a whole lot for you. But in the RX 500H, it's still going to be available to give you extra power on the rear and improve handling in some handling situations as well. You'll get 366 horsepower out of that system, 27 miles per gallon combined, but considerably less refinement than we find in the RX 350 or the RX 450. I'll talk about that in a bit. The RX 450 for me is the most interesting of these drivetrains. It's basically been lifted out of the RAV4 Prime, and it's also used in the plug-in hybrid Lexus NX. This hybrid system gives you 304 horsepower total, 37 miles of electric range, and 35 miles per gallon. It'll also charge in about 2.5 hours if you have access to a level 2 charger. Now, why do I find this the best expression of the Lexus RX? It's all about the smoothness of the drivetrain. It's the traditional Lexus system where we have a planetary power split system over there. It kind of feels like a CVT sometimes, but it's incredibly smooth. It's relatively quiet. It's very efficient. It's incredibly reliable. We do have reliability metrics on the RAV4 Prime. It has proved very, very good. And it also means that you're not going to have to stop for gas nearly as often. On the average driving cycle, say like mine, where I'm driving 36 miles each way from home to work, I would fill up with gas every 3 to 4 months. And that's probably one of the greater luxuries offered by the RX. The long hood and the relatively low roofline definitely give this a different vibe than the previous generation RX, and certainly different than a BMW X5 or a Mercedes-Benz GLE. But there's something else going on here. Even though this has a little bit of previous generation Lexus RXL going on in this area, this generation RX is strictly 2-row. If you want 3 rows, you want the Lexus TX. If you want off-road capability, you want a GX or an LX. And that's perhaps the most interesting thing about the Lexus lineup, is that they have a ton of different options depending on how much money you want to spend and how off-roady you want to get. The off-road capability of the GX and of course the LX are part of what allow the RX to be a bit more on-road focused. All versions are going to have 8.1 inches of ground clearance. That's decent, but remember that most of the lineup is going to have an all-wheel drive setup in the back. So you could get about 270 horsepower up front in the most powerful version, but you're only getting about 60 to 80 horsepower on the rear axle, depending on which version you're looking at and of course what you're doing out on the road. If you want the greater traction capability or greater off-road capability, you should take a look at the Lexus SUV lineup. Really accentuating the grown-up wagon vibe, we have a strong shoulder line here, we have a really wide light bar that stretches from one side all the way across to the other, and then we have a pretty steeply raked rear windshield. They tuck the wiper up there under the spoiler. Again, that's all possible because there's no 3-row version of the RX. On the downside, it definitely reduces cargo practicality. This has one of the smallest cargo areas ever seen in the Lexus RX. But because this was designed from the ground up to be hybrid and plug-in hybrid, there's actually no difference in terms of its cargo practicality between the hybrid, the plug-in hybrid, and just the regular turbo model. We of course have the RX 450H Plus badging there on the back. The H Plus thing I think is kind of odd. I would actually kind of like to see something a bit easier to say. And then down here at the bottom we find a bumper that doesn't try and imitate anything. So no fake exhaust tips or anything like that. The only exhaust tip is over there on the driver's side under the bumper. The profile of the RX definitely means that you have a different driving and seating position in the RX than in something like an X5. The seats feel closer to the ground, and the seating position is certainly more relaxed with your legs stretched out in front of you. When you take a look at legroom numbers, it's important to remember that it's calculated from your feet to your knees and then back there towards your hip point. So if you're sitting in a very upright position, a vehicle that has a smaller distance between the firewall and the very way back of the vehicle can actually look like it has more legroom. This has a very spacious cabin feel to it, but the actual legroom figures are going to be below some of those more upright options. This driver's seat is pretty adjustable. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar support, power extending thigh cushion there, and multi-way power memory linked adjustability. We also have a powered tilt telescopic steering column. And keep in mind that not every version of the RX is going to get the seats that we find in this model, and most of the RXs are going to have seats that are less adjustable than a lot of the European competitors. Moving to the back seat, the difference in legroom is going to be noticeable, especially if you're comparing this against some of those larger options. And keep in mind, the RX is not the largest in the segment. So with this front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, you can see I have maybe about 5 or 6 inches of legroom left, but you would find a roomier back seat in something like a BMW X5. You'll also find more headroom. Headroom is a little bit below average back here. It's really noticeable in the middle where my head is definitely touching the ceiling. But if I move back out to this outboard seating position, the more bucket style seat here gives me a bit more headroom. However, my hair is definitely brushing the ceiling. My head's pretty close right there. And then you'll notice the legroom. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I have maybe about 2.5 inches of legroom left. But there's still a ton of room back here for child seats, whether we're talking about a rear-facing infant seat like this, Or one of the larger convertible seats like this Kiko seat. This is suitable for kids up to 65 pounds, and it's definitely on the large side of the spectrum. But there's still plenty of room between the driver's seat and the child seat. And of course, because we have a wide bench seat in the back, there's definitely going to be more room back here for adults than you'll find in a Lexus NX. Behind the power hatch, we find 29.6 cubic feet of cargo capacity. Because of the way they've designed this hatch and the steep rake, it opens nice and high. So if you're a taller person, you'll definitely have plenty of clearance between the hatch and yourself when it's open. Also, it doesn't really protrude much beyond the back of the vehicle because it hinges way over there. On the downside, it means you get less room than a lot of the competition, especially the competition with available third rows, whether you choose the third row or not. And it means that a 22-inch roller bag like this just can't sit upright too close to the edge there. You could fit it in right there like that, and then line up about 4 of them across the back, but you'd have relatively little cargo space left in front of it. The cargo area is identical in every RX, but if you get the RX with the plug, you'll notice that under the cargo area, we don't have a spare tire, something you find in both other hybrids and the base model. I think it's actually a bit of a missed opportunity. Under this little panel, we find the 12-volt battery. Over here, we have a small storage area, but with most of the plastic dividers removed from the cargo area, you can see there's a reasonable amount of wasted space. They probably could have put a compact spare tire back here if they just relocated that one module. As we take a look around the interior, keep in mind that this is the top-end trim, so obviously there are going to be things in here that you won't find in the base model. We have the panoramic moonroof in this model. There's also a regular moonroof, or you can get the RX without the moonroof, and the RX with no moonroof at all is going to give you the most headroom. So if you're looking for a roomier ride, you definitely want to give up the glass thing on the ceiling. The driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable head restraints. This front passenger seat has a feature that we see in a lot of Genesis models. Lexus has borrowed it. It allows you to power tilt or power slide the front passenger seat forward to give those rear passengers a little bit more room, and of course it allows the rear passengers to do that as well. The seats are upholstered in a combination of leather and imitation suede, so we find imitation suede with this pattern on it on the shoulder section of the seat, also a bit up there on the headrest, and on the bolsters of the seats. We also find it on the doors and on the dashboard. The bolstering of these seats is not adjustable, but it's also not terribly aggressive, so larger folks shouldn't have any troubles finding a good seating position there. And the extending thigh cushion on these seats is a little bit different than we've seen in other Lexus models. This front section kind of moves out, sort of unaccordioning that section right there, for lack of a better term. Moving over to the front doors, we find a decent percentage of soft touch materials. Hard plastics help improve durability around that bottle holder and the storage cubby at the bottom of the door, but then the very bottom part of the door, that is a soft touch injection molded material. We then find a stitched armrest, nice and softly padded. It is brown, so your eyes are not deceiving you. So this is sort of a tricolor interior. We then find soft touch materials that match the seats in terms of color, that imitation suede section up there, the imitation leather panel on the door, soft touch injection molded upper section of the door. Lexus prefers imitation materials on the doors and on the dashboard to help improve long-term durability, so they won't bubble in the sunlight like a real leather upper dashboard would in some of the competition. Up here at the top of the dash, we find an injection molded upper and midsection, some of that imitation suede right there. Matching that, this is the ash bamboo trim on this particular model, soft touch facing to this portion of the dash, and then decently sized bin-style glove compartment with, yet again, more soft material around it, so very few hard plastics within easy reach of the driver or front passenger. We have this absolutely enormous touchscreen infotainment system in the middle of the dashboard, and it also combines some of the climate control functionality. It, of course, supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but that does not use the entire screen. It does, however, use the entire upper section, reserving just that lower section for climate control. If you want to do things like adjust certain vehicle settings or some of the active safety systems, etc., you have to go over there to the Lexus native interface, and that's where you get that row of icons on that side. We do have a reasonable amount of shiny black plastic in here, and that does surprise me because this is the kind of thing that's not going to wear well long term, especially being positioned right there around that power button. It does tend to scratch a little bit easily. Down here we find a button for the automated parking system, 360-degree camera system. I actually noticed some fine scratching on those buttons already right there. We then have a physical button for the power and volume control, front defroster, rear defogger, etc. Two big air vents here, kind of split, which is interesting. So this sort of satin chrome bar running right through the middle of that air vent, but you control everything through that one little fin there. Two USB-C charge-only ports with a place so you can stick your smartphone there. And then a large storage cubby right there with the actual USB inputs for the system. You can go wireless or wired if you want to, and there's a Qi wireless charging mat inside there. We then have two big cup holders over here, and you can lower the floor down. So if you want the cup holder to be shallower or deeper, you can do that, and then you would press the little button over here. Sorry, this front one's the only one that does that actually. Press that button right there and it kind of lifts up. The back one is fixed into place. Over here we have the joystick style shifter we've seen in other Lexus models for a while. Drive is back there like that. We then get enhanced engine braking back there in the sport mode. Park is that button right over there. Then we have the controls for the plug-in hybrid system. So these buttons are a little bit different than in the regular hybrid. Auto mode tells the system to do whatever it thinks is the most efficient at the time. You can also order the system into hybrid mode or EV mode or charge mode with that button right there. And then trail mode is sort of the off-road mode, asking the system to send a bit more power to the rear axle. Over here we have a bifold center armrest. You can open it from either side, so that's kind of a nice touch, with a pretty deep storage area because, of course, there's no transmission and no drive shaft going right there through the middle, like you'd find in an X5. Moving back up to the dashboard, you can see that microfiber insert right there spans right behind that infotainment system. We then have the color heads-up display right here, and then a somewhat small color LCD instrument cluster. This is the one thing I'm surprised Lexus has not updated, because we do find Lexus models now with a full LCD instrument cluster, but in this model it's a fairly small display, and then we get a digital display over here for the battery gauge and the fuel level over there on the right side. The reason I find this a little peculiar is because you can now get a RAV4 with a full LCD cluster, so I just sort of expected that they would have upgraded the Lexus RX. Moving out from there, we find a 3-spoke steering wheel, big paddles on the back, that's a nice touch. The driver monitoring system right there, that is optional. Then over here we have touch controls. If you don't get the heads-up display, you get some slightly different button banks that are more dedicated. With this vehicle, you would actually use the heads-up display to see what these buttons do, and then you'd use this button to change their function in the software. Very similar button bank over here on this side. All right, it's time to get the RX out on the road, and the first thing you'll notice is, wow, there is a lot of front wheel spin, and that's because all of the hybrid models have the vast majority of their power on the front axle. Yes, this does have all-wheel drive standard, but the all-wheel drive system just cannot send that much power to the rear. The vast majority is always happening up front. So we certainly get a lot of one-wheel peel just any way you slice it if the road surface is not absolutely perfect. Now, this is pretty similar to what we find in a Volvo XC60 plug-in hybrid or an XC90 plug-in hybrid with a lot less power. So those Volvos, 455 horsepower total, about 300 up front, 150 on the rear axle. The big difference is that that's actually more than double the amount of power on the rear axle. So those can actually have a significant benefit on the handling ability of the vehicle and, of course, acceleration times. We should definitely talk about acceleration because some interesting things happen in this lineup. The slowest version is going to be the RX 350 Turbo. So the base engine is the slowest, 7.5 seconds, 0 to 60. You might be thinking to yourself, how is that possible since it produces more power than the hybrid system? That one comes in at 7.3 seconds, and those were vehicles I was able to borrow from a local dealer. The hybrid system is faster because there are no gears to shift through, and we get all of that torque from the electric motor, and it all happens in a very linear fashion. It can also keep the engine at its most optimum power band as you're accelerating, thanks to its eCVT-like nature. Now, it's not really a CVT, so it's not going to have that rubber bandy feel that you'll find in, say, an Infiniti or a Nissan CVT, because this is a very different kind of drivetrain at its core. Now, the two other hybrid systems are also interesting, because both of these, the RX 450h and 500h, went 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds. Now you might be thinking to yourself, hang on, what's going on? Well, the 500h performs about the same as Lexus's estimates. The RX 450h actually out-indexes those estimates, and we're not the only ones that have noticed that. Car and Driver, Motor Trend, some of our friends over at TFL, Redline, etc., they've also noticed that the plug-in hybrid system is definitely faster than you might expect. And again, we get a lot of the same benefit here. In the 500h, you have to wait for that 6-speed automatic transmission to shift, and it only has 6 gears, so the gears are a little bit further spaced apart than the 8-speed that you find in the RX 350, and this, it has no gears to shift through, so it's just going to deliver you maximum acceleration whenever you floor it. That's one of the benefits to this type of hybrid system. The other benefit is just how smooth it is, and that's another thing you'll notice in the RX 500h. It's just not as smooth as you've come to expect from Lexus hybrids. The thing that I had not expected is that the RX 500h doesn't actually handle better than this. And that's because the RX 450h and the 500h weigh about the same. There's really less than 100 pounds weight difference. They have very similar tires and tire sizes on them. And this has a slightly different weight balance. It actually shoves more of the weight to the back. So interestingly, in some of the outlets that have access to skid pads or have done figure 8 testing, they actually find that this handles a little bit better than the 500h. What I noticed out on my daily driving is that this has a better feel to it. The 500h feels a little bit more video game-like thanks to that rear electric steering system. It does have 4-wheel steering back there. And even though it produces more power from its rear electric motor than we find in this one under a broader range of different circumstances, this just has so much more torque and so instantly accessible power that whether we're talking about passing maneuvers or 0 to 60 times, this feels peppier than its number would otherwise indicate, because you just floor it and you get all that instant power. You don't have to wait for the transmission to shift. You don't have to wait for that single clutch thing to do its thing. And that's the downside to the 500h system. It has that single electric motor up front, so it's always going to feel a little bit herky-jerky in stop and go and slow and go traffic. This is going to feel much more sorted. Now, the downside to all of this is that I'm going to give handling a C+ for all RX versions. This is definitely tuned towards the softer side of things. We have relatively narrow all-season tires in all of these models. Something like a Volvo XC60 is going to feel more engaging. A BMW X5 is certainly going to handle better than the RX. I have to temper that somewhat with the price tag of the RX. Keep in mind this is going to be less expensive than a lot of those European options, but they're simply going to handle better. Oh dear. And yes, I just managed to windshield wiper away my GoPro, which is definitely a bummer. Let's hope we can find it here. It is not in a convenient locale to be found. So pause on this for a second. Hey, look at that, it made it. I mean, you got a cracked screen, but you know, hey, we can't have everything, can we? When it comes to the ride quality, I'm absolutely going to give this model an A. Even when compared against some of the competition that has adaptive air suspensions, this is still going to be the more comfortable ride. Those will have the ability to change their ride to be softer or firmer whenever they want to, also lift the vehicle up and down. But here, we just have a comfortable ride all the time. So if you want your RX to be a bit sportier, you're going to have to get the F Sport version, although interestingly, it doesn't necessarily handle any better than this version, but it is going to have that slightly firmer ride quality that some people might be interested in. With the cameras back on the car, I apologize for the little line on one of the cameras. It kind of got a broken lens there on its tumble from grace. But back here to the RX. Interestingly, the RX 450h is probably going to be the quietest RX because it's going to spend a lot of time in electric-only operation. Right now I'm in the EV drive mode, and I can accelerate no problem at all in electric-only operation. Obviously, 0 to 60 is going to take a lot longer here, mind you. It took about 11 seconds for this to go 0 to 60 in electric-only mode. I know a lot of folks are going to complain about that, but it really does not feel slow, to be honest, because you can actually get a little bit of one-wheel peel. In stop and go and slow and go traffic, city traffic, it feels pretty peppy. And merging onto the freeway, you're not usually doing that in even 7.5 seconds. So trust me, 11 seconds is going to feel just fine. Bottom line out on the road, if you're looking for an RX and you want the ultimate RX, I wouldn't get the RX 500h. I would get the plug-in hybrid. And if you're not interested in the plug-in hybrid or the RX 500h, I would get the 350h. It's quicker, it's more fuel efficient, and statistically, it's likely to be more long-term reliable than the regular RX 350. It also, I think, actually just fulfills the Lexus values of being comfortable and quiet and isolated from the world and delivering a really smooth driving experience. The fact that it doesn't have gears to shift through alone should be a reason to get that RX 350h. But if that's not enough for you, consider the fact that you could be getting nearly 40 miles per gallon if you drive this big, comfy crossover gently. And if you get the plug-in hybrid version, not only are you getting that fantastic fuel economy, but you're not going to be visiting the gas station very often at all. With that out of the way, let's move into the comparisons, because this is, again, a little bit interesting. The first one we should talk about here is the BMW X3. It's one of the best-selling entries in the compact segment, and I think it's easy to see why. There's an X3 for everybody. The price tag has a huge span. Excluding the BMW X3M, just the other core versions of the X3, it goes from $47,895 on up to $76,570. So it actually bookends the RX just a little bit on each side. You obviously get better handling. You get a rear-wheel drive vehicle, you get very tight European proportions, the handling ability of the vehicle, the tuning of the suspension, the steering, etc. Everything is definitely tighter and more engaging. Not necessarily more comfortable. That's definitely one reason to get the Lexus RX, is that it has that classically softer luxury car ride to it. Now, another reason to get the RX over time has been that the cabin is roomier and it has a bigger cargo area. But in this generation, the cabin is a little roomier, but not in every dimension. You actually get a little bit more legroom, but less headroom in reality, depending on the version you're looking at, and only 1 cubic foot more cargo space in the Lexus versus the BMW. It's actually just a hair less than 1 cubic foot. Now, if you're considering something a little bit larger in the BMW lineup, like the X5, you should know it's going to be a lot more expensive. It is going to give you more cargo room. It's also going to give you more power, etc., but it's going to be a lot more expensive, and that's why we're not going to talk about it in this video. Instead, let's move along to another competitor from Europe, the Volvo XC60. The XC60 is intriguing because on the inside, you actually get very similar dimensions in most ways to the Lexus RX, and that's because these are both transverse-engined vehicles, so packaging efficiency is generally a little bit better than some of the rear-wheel drive options, and we certainly see that in the XC60. Especially if you're looking at the plug-in hybrid, because the plug-in hybrid doesn't lose any cargo space or any legroom versus the non-plug-in hybrid version of the XC60. Now, at the moment, there's no regular hybrid XC60. You either get the base mild hybrid or you get the full-on bonkers 455 horsepower plug-in hybrid. If you're looking for a plug-in hybrid in this segment, I think it's easy to see why Volvo has really cornered the market. It's by far the best-selling plug-in hybrid in this group. And interestingly, Volvo has really risen to a decent amount of sales success based on their plug-in hybrid systems. Now, moving along to the Acura RDX, Acura's option in this segment is obviously a very direct competitor. Classically, the RX and the MDX were competitors, but now, of course, we have the Acura MDX. It's a 2-row vehicle. The RX is 2-row only, the MDX is 3-row only, and we have the Lexus TX. So that's helped define things just a little bit in this segment. Hands down, the RDX is the value entry here. It spans from $45,700 on up to $56,100, so a much narrower pricing range than we find in most. Now, obviously, there's no hybrid, there's no plug-in hybrid, but on the other hand, we get one of the more dynamic options, especially when you're looking at an option with higher reliability. So, generally speaking, Lexus is going to be the most reliable. Acura is probably going to be a close second if I were a betting man here, but I like the dynamics of the RDX better. We get the super handling all-wheel drive system with torque vectoring rear axles. We get the 10-speed automatic transmission, which is fantastic, etc. The engine produces just a hair less power than we find in the RX, but thanks to the transmission and the really aggressive gearing, it feels very, very peppy. At this point in time, we don't have a higher horsepower RDX, however. Everybody is assuming that when we get a refreshed RDX, we're also going to get an RDX Type S, but we don't have any information on that. Last but not least, we have the Lincoln Nautilus, which has been completely redesigned for this model year. The Nautilus is the most direct competitor to the RX, not just because it's about the same size and about the same price, but because it was truly designed with the Lexus RX in mind. Not just this generation Nautilus, but the MKX and Nautilus that came before this model as well. Price-wise, it is going to start a little bit higher, though. $52,655 starting, and it's going to go on up a little higher than the Lexus, up to $84,040. There are a few reasons for that. The first one is it has absolutely enormous LCD standard. The driver's side LCD spans all the way from one pillar all the way across the dashboard to the other pillar. It is an absolutely enormous array of LCDs, and then we get a big touchscreen LCD in the middle of everything. That LCD array is a little bit more functional than I had initially given it credit for, and I actually like the look in person more than I did in pictures. If you're really on the fence about this, I would say go to the Lincoln dealer, check it out, see it in person, and decide whether you like it or not. If you're not a fan of big LCDs, then clearly you're going to want to steer away, because big LCDs are the only way you can get the Nautilus. On the other hand, the interior is notably roomier than the Lexus. The cargo area is also notably roomier than the Lexus.
And the hybrid system is a pretty decent deal. It's just a $1,500 bump over the regular Nautilus, and you get 310 horsepower out of that hybrid system. Definitely better performance than the regular hybrid in the Lexus RX. Now, interesting twist. We haven't had this at home to test yet, but in our initial testing at the launch of the Nautilus, it's not any faster than the RX 450h Plus. In fact, actually, it's a little bit slower. The best way to describe the Lincoln is that it's marching to its own drummer, something that I would honestly say Lexus used to do with the RX, but over time, Lexus has tried to make the RX a little bit sportier, a little bit more in line with some of the other competitors in this segment, and I think it's lost a little bit of itself in that process. Meanwhile, the Lincoln, it's not trying to be a BMW X3 competitor or even a Volvo XC60 competitor. It's just doing its own thing with relatively high fuel economy, about 30 miles per gallon in that hybrid system, and just a different kind of ride tuning and steering and suspension tuning. It's very soft, very comfortable. It doesn't become wallowy, but is certainly on the soft side of things. So if you're looking for a comfortable, I honestly would say classic Lexus style ride, you actually want to take a look at the Lincoln Nautilus. And that's why my pick in this segment honestly would be the Nautilus. The other thing that you should know is that the hybrid system can be had relatively inexpensively in the Nautilus. $52,655 is where this starts, plus $1,500 for that hybrid system. That is significantly less expensive than a Lexus RX 500h or, of course, the 450h Plus. It is going to be a little bit more than the regular hybrid system in the Lexus, but you also get more power out of that hybrid system and a very different kind of vibe. And then obviously, if you love LCDs like I do, then you're going to want to gravitate towards that Lincoln. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below. Would you pick the Lincoln? Would you pick the Lexus? Or would you go a little bit off script and get that 455 horsepower plug-in hybrid XC60? I have to say, if I were simply looking for the most luxurious interior, the most comfortable and style-forward interior, I would probably get the Volvo. I know some folks are going to say I wouldn't cross-shop the Lexus and the Volvo because of reliability, and that's a valid concern, but if you're interested in luxury, then definitely consider that Volvo as well. Let me know what you think about all that down there. Find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And I'll see all of you next week.